I woke up with my stepfather touching my face. It was dark. Silence. Barely audible breathing above my ear. His lips were dangerously close. I had to scream. I should have run away. But he smiled and whispered, "It's our secret now, Lily." When my mother announced she was marrying Christopher, I simply nodded and forced a smile. Yet inside, something scraped against the walls of my soul, a nagging unease that I couldn't shake off. I kept my expression neutral as if nothing was wrong, even though deep down I sensed a storm brewing. Christopher was different. He didn't try to charm me with sweet words or play the caring stepfather. He was simply there. His steady gaze was calculated, and his voice, always a shade softer than necessary, cut through the silence like a quiet command. That first evening, when we were left alone in the house, the tension was palpable. We sat in the living room, and the room's quiet was broken only by the faint hum of the refrigerator. I pretended to scroll through my phone, but I couldn't ignore the way he studied me. His eyes held an intensity that said he was weighing every word I might speak. Then, without warning, he leaned forward slightly and smiled. "If you ever need someone you can trust, just tell me, Lily," he said calmly. His tone was direct, and his eyes never left mine as he spoke. I managed a short reply, merely nodding as I masked my unease. I didn't know then that this was the opening move in a dangerous game that would soon engulf my life. The following day, while I helped clear the breakfast dishes, I noticed him lingering by the doorway, arms folded, as if planning his next move. He didn't speak, but the way he observed every move I made felt like I was under surveillance. I stepped away quickly, determined not to get drawn into his calculated game, yet his presence was impossible to ignore. Later that afternoon, as I headed for the store, I caught him in the hallway. He blocked my path for a split second. "Need help with something?" he asked in a measured tone. I hesitated but then mumbled, "I'm fine." His eyes flickered with something I couldn't quite place, approval or challenge, I wasn't sure, but he stepped aside without further comment. That night, after everyone had gone to bed, I crept down the stairs to grab a book from the study. The house was silent, and I almost missed the sound of a door closing. I turned sharply when I heard a faint rustle behind me. Christopher was there, standing in the shadow of the hall. He didn't say a word. Instead, he moved closer with deliberate steps. I backed up until I nearly collided with the table. "Lily," he said quietly, "you should be more cautious at night." His hand reached out to steady me as I stumbled, but the contact was too controlled, calculated. I managed to catch myself and stepped back, narrowing my eyes. "Why are you here?" I demanded, my voice firmer than I felt. He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he simply observed me with a gaze that implied he was testing my limits. Then he murmured, "You know what you're doing, don't you?" His tone wasn't accusatory, it was more like a prompt. I had no choice but to stand my ground. In the following days, his actions grew bolder. At breakfast, he deliberately sat near me, even though there was an empty seat on the far side of the table. At dinner, he would pass by with a calculated slowness, his eyes locked on mine. Each movement seemed designed to unsettle me. I tried to focus on my studies, on my friends, anything to avoid his looming presence, but the intensity of his actions kept drawing me back. One afternoon, I found him in the garage, looking through a box of old photographs. Without a word, he slid a faded picture across the concrete floor towards me. I hesitated, then picked it up. It wasn't a family photo, just an image of an unknown place. "What's this about?" I asked, keeping my voice neutral. He looked up, his eyes glinting. "It's a clue," he said simply, then stood up abruptly and left the room. His actions were deliberate, his timing precise. I couldn't decide whether to be angry or intrigued. That evening, while I was alone in my room, my phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number. It was a single sentence: "Trust is earned in actions, not words." My pulse quickened as I reread the text. I didn't know if it was from him or someone else, but it confirmed that every interaction was part of something larger, a game with rules I was only beginning to understand. The next day, I confronted my mother about Christopher. "Why does he keep appearing at odd times?" I asked casually, hoping for a simple explanation. My mother brushed off my concerns with a tight smile. "He's just trying to make a good impression," she said, but her eyes told another story, one of worry and unspoken doubts. Later, I caught a glimpse of him in the reflection of a shop window. He was watching me, his gaze penetrating. I felt a chill, but I pressed on with my day, determined not to let his calculated moves disrupt my routine. Yet, each encounter left me more alert, more aware that my life was no longer entirely under my control. I began to map out his actions in my head, tracking every deliberate move he made. It wasn't long before I realized that his simple offer, "If you ever need someone you can trust," was just the beginning of a game I hadn't agreed to play. His calculated presence in every part of my day was a signal that I was now caught in his web, a game of trust and control that I was desperate to escape. I didn't understand the full extent of what was unfolding around me, but one fact became undeniable. Every move he made was a step deeper into a plot that would soon change everything. And I hadn't even begun to fight back. I then did not understand how far it would go. Mom stayed late at work, leaving Christopher and me alone in the spacious, silent living room. I idly scrolled through my phone while he tapped at his device, his eyes occasionally darting up as if searching for the right moment. The air was charged with a tension that I couldn't ignore. Without preamble, Christopher broke the silence. "There's an experiment," he said, his tone measured and direct. I looked up, curiosity momentarily overtaking caution. "What kind of experiment?" I asked, my voice even. He set his phone aside and leaned forward. 36 questions, after which two people start to feel a connection. I arched an eyebrow. "You're proposing a game?" He shook his head slightly. "I'm offering you the truth." Before I could protest, he pulled out a small notepad and a pen from his jacket pocket. He wrote down the first question and then looked at me steadily. "First question, if you could have dinner with anyone in the world, who would it be?" I hesitated for a split second before replying with a half-smile. "Honestly? You." My tone was teasing, light, but when I lifted my gaze, his eyes were unyielding, serious and expectant. Christopher didn't smile at my response. Instead, he nodded slowly and turned the page on his notepad. He looked up again as he read the next question aloud. "Second question, what is the boldest thing you have ever done?" I paused only long enough to consider the simplicity of the challenge. "I agreed to this game," I said plainly. A brief smile tugged at the corners of his mouth. "Don't lie, Lily," he countered sharply, his eyes locked on mine as if daring me to elaborate. He flipped to another page, his finger tracing the written words before reading the next prompt. "Fifth question, what do you find the most attractive in a person?" I crossed my arms in defiance and uncertainty, keeping my tone neutral. "How they look at you," I answered, my words clipped and factual. Christopher leaned back in his chair, the muscles in his jaw tightening. Then he leaned forward again, his tone shifting as he delivered the next line. "How do I look at you right now?" For a heartbeat, I froze. His question wasn't rhetorical, it was a challenge. I struggled to maintain my composure, but his intense stare made my response impossible to formulate immediately. He didn't pause long. Instead, he flipped to the next question, his pen poised. "Seventh question, what is something you want to try but are too afraid to admit?" I wanted to give a mundane answer, something safe, but my voice betrayed the quickening of my pulse. Before I could speak, the silence stretched out until I heard his low, steady voice. "Some things are better left unanswered." At that moment, Christopher tilted his head slightly, as if gauging my reaction. His eyes searched mine, and I felt every second stretch into an eternity of unspoken understanding. I took a slow breath and tried to steady myself. The experiment wasn't just about asking questions. It was a gauntlet thrown down between us. Each question felt like a deliberate move designed to uncover secrets or push boundaries. The pace was relentless. One question bled into the next, each more probing than the last. My hand, which had been fiddling with the edge of my sleeve, finally stopped moving. I met his gaze with a mixture of defiance and uncertainty. "I'm not sure I'm ready to share everything," I said, my tone firm yet cautious. Christopher's smile returned, this time without the earlier playfulness, replaced by a determined calm. "Then let's try," he said simply. For a moment, the room fell silent as he awaited my next words. The experiment wasn't just about these questions. It was a test of trust and vulnerability, one that I hadn't agreed to but was now forced to face head-on. I glanced down at the notepad, then back at him. "Fine," I said, voice low. "But remember, the truth isn't always kind." He nodded, a silent agreement passing between us. The game had only just begun, and each question, each carefully measured response, was a step further into a connection that was as dangerous as it was inevitable. The tension in the room shifted from uncertainty to an unspoken challenge. With the notepad in hand and a clear purpose in his eyes, Christopher prepared to ask the next question, and I braced myself for whatever revelation might follow. The next day, something changed. Christopher was no longer simply Mom's husband. He had become part of a game, a dangerous play that neither of us had agreed to. I noticed the shift immediately, even before the day had truly begun. That morning, while I was absent-mindedly combing my hair in front of the mirror, I caught sight of him standing in the doorway. His presence was impossible to ignore. Without a hint of preamble, he said, "Don't braid." I blinked in surprise. "What?" I managed, caught off guard by the unexpected command. He didn't elaborate, only adding, "Better to have it loose." His tone was firm and unyielding, leaving no room for discussion. I knew I should have rolled my eyes, pretended not to care, but I couldn't. His words struck a chord, and I found myself frozen in place, my hair still half-combed. The day carried on with an undercurrent of tension. Throughout our shared spaces, his actions became more pointed. It wasn't the casual, fleeting contact of a stranger passing by. It was deliberate, each touch carrying its own weight. When we were in the living room, he would brush his hand lightly against my back as he moved past me, a touch that lasted just a second too long. It wasn't overt, but it was enough to make me aware that he was playing a different role now. During one of our late afternoon sessions sitting in the den, we found ourselves close together on a worn leather couch. The room was quiet except for the soft hum of the television in the background. As we talked, his fingers casually traced along the edge of my knee. It wasn't a bold gesture, but it sent a jolt through me, a reminder that boundaries were shifting. I tried to focus on the conversation, but every time his hand grazed my skin, the air around us seemed to crackle with an unspoken intensity. The final straw came that evening when I went to the kitchen for a glass of milk. The house was dimly lit, and I moved quietly, not expecting to encounter anything out of the ordinary. As I reached for a bottle on the fridge, I felt a sudden pressure near my side. I turned to see him standing uncomfortably close, his eyes fixed on me. "Hand me the glass?" he said in a voice that was low, warm, and uncomfortably near my ear. His tone left no room for refusal. I staggered back slightly, the cold glass bottle nearly slipping from my grasp. My hand trembled, and for a split second, I thought I'd drop it entirely. I managed to steady the bottle and quickly handed it over, my voice barely above a whisper, "Here." The brief contact between his fingers and mine sent a chill down my spine. It was one thing to share a conversation or a laugh, but this was different. This was a physical assertion that I couldn't easily dismiss. All day, the echoes of these encounters haunted me. Every look, every touch, was a move in this unsettling game. I realized that Christopher was no longer just fulfilling the role assigned to him. He was testing limits, pushing boundaries with a confidence that was both alluring and intimidating. I felt as though I was being drawn into a dance I hadn't chosen to join, every step calculated and laden with consequences. I moved through the rest of the day on autopilot, my mind replaying his commands and touches. Each moment built up like a series of small shocks, gradually eroding the safe distance I had once maintained. I began to wonder what his true intentions were and whether I had already crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. That night, as I lay in bed with the events of the day swirling in my head, I realized that this wasn't just a phase or a fleeting moment of awkwardness. This was a deliberate strategy. Each encounter, each command, was meant to blur the lines between right and wrong, between comfort and danger. I didn't know how to react, and I wasn't sure I wanted to react at all. The game was now in full swing, and every move he made forced me to question not just his actions, but my own responses. I lay there, unable to sleep, wondering what his next move would be and how much further he intended to push. In that silent darkness, the reality became clear. I was caught in a game that could change everything, and ignoring it was no longer an option. At night, when the kitchen was drowning in twilight, I felt him before I even saw him. The space was dim, the only light coming from the street lamp filtering through the window. I was reaching for a glass on the counter when a presence brushed past me. I froze, half expecting to turn and confront an intruder, but instead, I sensed him drawing closer. I took a step back instinctively, yet somehow my body betrayed me and remained rooted to the spot. In that suspended moment, he stepped forward, and I could see the calm determination in his eyes as he moved within the shadows. Without breaking the quiet, he reached out. His hand, deliberate and gentle, swept a loose strand of hair from my face, tucking it behind my ear. I felt his touch, and I did not pull away. Instead, I stayed still, my body tense yet unresponsive, as if I were caught in a silent agreement. He paused, his eyes searching mine as if he were reading a secret. In that fleeting moment, his expression changed. It was as if he understood every unspoken word and recognized the signals I never intended to send. The understanding was clear. My inaction had spoken volumes. Then his fingers moved again. This time, they glided along my wrist. The contact was soft but insistent, like a question that demanded an answer. He broke the silence with a husky inquiry. "Are you afraid of me, Lily?" The question struck me sharply, and I felt an unexpected warmth swell in my throat, as if the very blood were pulsing louder. I managed a quiet, measured response. No, my voice was low, almost swallowed by the stillness of the room. He leaned in even closer, his presence filling the narrow space between us. His gaze locked on mine, and he murmured, "Too bad." The words hung in the air, heavy and unyielding, as his hand slowly continued its journey. It slid downward along my arm and paused on my shoulder, a movement that was both possessive and gentle, blurring the line between threat and tenderness. I knew I should have pushed him away, taken a step to reassert my space, but in that moment, all rational thought evaporated. Instead of resisting, I found myself whispering, "I must leave." The words were barely audible, lost in the quiet hum of the refrigerator and the soft ticking of the clock on the wall. His response was immediate. A slight, enigmatic smile curved his lips as if he had been waiting for this very moment. "But you're not leaving," he said, his tone firm and final, leaving no room for negotiation. His words resonated around us, and for an instant, the room seemed to shrink, the space between us collapsing into something uncomfortably intimate. The kitchen, with its cold tiles and muted colors, suddenly transformed into a stage for this quiet confrontation. Every sound was amplified, the clink of a glass, the rustle of his clothes, and the soft exhale of my breath. His hand remained on my shoulder, the pressure deliberate yet not overtly forceful, as if he was both comforting and confining me in the same motion. I searched his face, trying to discern whether his intentions were protective or possessive. The ambiguity in his eyes only deepened the tension, a puzzle I wasn't sure I wanted to solve. With the finality of his statement echoing in the air, the dynamics between us had shifted irreversibly. There was no escape now. Every moment was charged with the weight of what was happening, each touch drawing us deeper into a game neither of us had fully chosen to play. In that narrow, dimly lit kitchen, with the night pressing in on all sides, I realized that boundaries had been redrawn. His subtle insistence was a clear declaration. Whatever was unfolding between us was not a fleeting mistake, but a deliberate act. And as I stood there, caught between the desire to flee and the force of his will, the inevitable truth became clear. I was no longer in control of the game. With his hand still resting on my shoulder and his smile lingering as a promise and a threat, the night closed in, leaving me with one undeniable fact. I wasn't going anywhere. The door clicked on the lock. "This will remain between us, Lily," Christopher said, his voice soft but carrying a weight that filled the space between us. The tension in the room was palpable, denser than the darkness outside the window. I slowly turned back toward him, my eyes drawn to his hand, still resting casually on the key. "And what is it that should remain between us?" I asked, my tone even but laced with uncertainty. A slow smile spread across his face, the kind that promised victory before the game was even over. "Everything," he replied, stepping closer so that the distance between us seemed to vanish. His eyes locked on mine, challenging yet inviting, as if daring me to make a move. I stood my ground, though every fiber of my being urged me to retreat. His fingers reached out again, this time grazing my wrist in a deliberate, measured caress. "If you want to go, go," he murmured, his tone dismissive, yet the touch that followed belied his words. His hand slid higher, tracing a light path through the thin fabric of my t-shirt, moving slowly toward my elbow. I felt each delicate, calculated movement as if it were a question I had to answer. For a moment, I searched his eyes, hoping to decipher his true intent. Was this merely flirtation, or was there something more dangerous lurking beneath his controlled exterior? The air around us crackled with unspoken promises and hidden threats. I knew that every touch had consequences, every word a calculated risk. "You're playing a dangerous game, Christopher," I said, my voice barely above a whisper, even as my body remained still, unwilling or unable to move away. He leaned in even closer, the heat of his presence overwhelming. "And you're not playing it?" he challenged, his tone light yet edged with a quiet intensity that left no room for doubt. I tried to respond, but before I could form a coherent reply, he lowered his gaze to my wrist again. His fingers, now more deliberate, pressed lightly as if measuring the strength of my resolve. I felt my breath catch in my throat as he paused, letting the silence stretch out between us like a taut rope waiting to snap. Then, in that charged moment, my lips parted in a silent gasp, an involuntary reaction that spoke volumes even without words. Christopher's eyes flickered at the sight, and for one heartbeat, I thought he might lean in further. But instead, he let his hand drift slowly upward, the pads of his fingers gliding with practiced ease over the sensitive skin near my shoulder. Time seemed to slow as the intensity between us escalated. I closed my eyes briefly, trying to steady the whirlwind of emotions that surged within me. His touch was intimate without crossing into outright seduction, a boundary we both knew not to breach. The flirtation was subtle, the intimacy raw and unspoken. Every shift in his expression, every movement of his hand, promised that the night was far from over. Just as the tension reached its peak, a sudden, sharp voice sliced through the charged atmosphere. "What is happening here?" Mom's voice rang out, unexpected and forceful, shattering the delicate balance we had so carefully constructed. I jerked away as if struck, my heart pounding in my ears, and the room transformed instantly from a private haven into a battleground of secrets and exposed truths. Christopher straightened slowly, his expression switching from intense allure to an unreadable calm. His hand lingered in the air for a moment before dropping to his side. With a measured exhale, he spoke in a tone that was almost nonchalant. "Perhaps we really should talk." The confrontation had come too soon. In the wake of Mom's intrusion, the simmering tension cooled to an uneasy calm, but the charged energy still clung to every word. I stood there, caught between the desire to flee and the magnetic pull of his presence. The promise of that dangerous game hung heavily in the air, its outcome uncertain. Within minutes, the living room erupted into chaos. Mom's disapproving glare filled the space as she swiftly gathered Christopher's belongings. Her words were sharp, slicing through the remnants of our flirtatious exchange. With a final look that conveyed both betrayal and resolve, she escorted him out the door, slamming it shut behind him. The echo of the door's click resonated long after, marking the end of a chapter one wasn't sure I wanted to close. I stood frozen for a long, agonizing minute, my mind a jumble of conflicting emotions. The charged intimacy we had shared, the subtle, dangerous flirtation, all of it evaporated in the face of Mom's decisive intervention. I wanted to protest, to explain, but the words stuck in my throat like a secret too heavy to bear. For half a year, I did not speak with her. Not because I didn't want to, but because I didn't know what to say. In that final moment before she left, Christopher's parting words still echoed in my mind, a promise and a threat entwined in a single breath. And even as the scandal raged around me, I couldn't shake the feeling that the game was far from over. The night had ended with a flurry of confusion and unanswered questions, leaving me with an undeniable truth. Some games leave marks that time can't erase, and some boundaries, once crossed, can never be redrawn.